All right, Eric, should we get going? We get
Let's do it.
started?
Let's do it.
10:02? Yeah, we're off and running. So we probably have a bunch of other people joining as we go, which is terrific as people move from Zoom to Zoom and back-to-back Zoom. So it's terrific. So I'm Stratton Lloyd. I'm the COO and Vice President of Community Leadership at the Essex County Community Foundation. And I want to give a huge thanks and welcome to all for joining us and participating today in this ECCF event. And we are extremely excited and enthusiastic about this topic, and grateful to Eric Curtis and Curtis Strategy for his time and expertise today to help us all be a little smarter on this important topic. At ECCF, during this terrible time of COVID, which is absolutely overwhelming for everyone on all levels, we've tried to focus on three priorities as a community foundation. Number one has been attracting and deploying philanthropic resources, so raising money and trying to get that money out for organizations working with the most vulnerable populations as fast as possible. And across our many initiatives, and primarily our COVID response fund, we have raised nearly $7 million and deployed over $5 million, and we're continuing actively deploying that money. And this work is obviously imperative and continues full speed, and will continue throughout the summer and throughout the fall as the COVID crisis and recovery continues for a long time, unfortunately. In addition to these discretionary funds, our ECCF fund holders, which we are extremely proud of, have accelerated their giving and have deployed over $3 million in grants since March, which is about a 65% increase in year-to-year giving. And so we're very proud of that and continue to try to inspire and motivate our fund holders to give now and give early for this crisis. The second thing we've been focusing on is gathering and sharing information and resources to our nonprofit friends and partners, as well as to the small business community, which is struggling from many of the same challenges of our nonprofits. And this work has included trainings, webinars like today, and many, many communications. We appreciate your patience with our communications, but we are erring on the side of trying to get information out as information changes so rapidly during this crisis. And we've tried to do that with speed and as concisely as possible. So thanks to all of our communication team, Crystal and others that have been leading that charge and doing that for us. Finally, the third thing that we've really tried to focus on as a community foundation in the middle of a lot of this great work happening across the county at the nonprofit, the municipal, the employer, the funder level. In the middle of a lot of that, we've really focused on trying to use that perspective and lens that we have to inspire and activate community connections and collaborations. And we have surveyed and talked to hundreds of nonprofits throughout this process and continuously do that in a way to sort of gather community feedback and take the pulse of what's happening in the field as key to everything that we're doing. Leaders across these organizations, trustees across these organizations have commented on the deep interconnectedness we all feel during this crisis, and have constantly inquired as to how their organizations can be improving their collaborative effectiveness. How can they be doing that more and extending it? And that is what today is all about. So listening to that, hearing that, we just felt like we had to move and we had to present something to start that conversation. So today is really just an introduction to partnerships, affiliations, and mergers. And this is we're gonna go over some of the concepts, the vernacular, the language, the process, and share many, many examples through Eric's deep experience and expertise in this area. And this is something we all need to have front of mind in our work today. And the goal today is to help us all think through what this means as we think about collaboration and partnership, what this means for us as individuals, as organizations, and as a collective community. So we are super excited to embark on this conversation broader as a county. And with that introduction and context, I'm going to hand it off to our speaker today, Mr. Eric Curtis, President, one of our own local businesses, Curtis Strategy. So Eric, it's all you. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Stratton. I appreciate it. Thank you, Stratton and Beth and Crystal for your help, and the team at ECCF for your partnership in putting this webinar together. And I also want to thank everybody that's participating, that's attending today. Hopefully you'll get to learn quite a bit about the different constructs, different models, different strategic options that are available. I also want to just give a quick shout out and thank you to my team who has helped inspired a lot of this content. In this webinar, we're going to go through 4 different sections. We're going to talk a little bit about the macro landscape and what's going on in the world that's really driving a lot of these partnerships, affiliations, and mergers. I'm going to give you some specific examples of models that are available to use and the pros and cons of them. And then we're going to look at how you can start conversations from right from the start, right from the beginning, with applying a little bit of this knowledge, and then walk you through a little bit of deal implementation. At the end of section 2, 3, and obviously at the end, we're going to stop, take about 4 or 5 minutes worth of questions, so that will be broken up, and please use the chat feature for that. So this is about partnerships, mergers, affiliations, and really kind of what's going on in the world of strategy. And the landscape has really changed due to COVID-19. However, the trends that were happening before COVID-19 with mergers and affiliations were still in existence. What COVID-19 did was really strap a rocket to it. And there was exponential growth, exponential urgency, and pressure to look at some of these strategies. So in this first section, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about what's driving consolidation, these major categories, and talk through them a little bit so you have a little context going in to when we talk about the models. So our focus, just to give a little bit of context in relationship to the content that you're going to hear, is in these 4 areas. I've done a lot of work in education and higher ed, healthcare, human services, and then 501c6 professional associations. I think one thing that's worth pointing out, though, is that regardless of what sector that we're operating in, the trends that we're about to go through and talk through are relevant in all 4 of these nonprofit sectors. And so just to kind of start at a high level with some of the big things that are going on, in health and human services before COVID and even now are going through healthcare reform, a shift towards accountable care, a shift towards person-centered planning, value-based reimbursement, et cetera. And colleges and universities in 2026 are going to experience an enrollment cliff. And that manifested from the financial crisis of 2008, where people stopped having kids by about 20%. So in 2026, there'll be about 20% less 18-year-olds going to college. That's the enrollment cliff. And obviously, there was a shift before COVID to virtual education, but because of COVID-19, it's really accelerated a lot of higher ed's urgency and need, or even education as a whole, to push to virtual capabilities. Professional associations, 501c6s, one of the big things that we're seeing is member diversification, the need to serve a broader level of membership. And then lastly, because associations operate local, regional, national, and even international levels, all of those geographic boundaries are going away because of virtual capabilities and the need for virtual education, which changes the competitive landscape. So one theme you'll hear a lot as we go through this presentation, as we talk through it, is going to be technology. Again, technology can be a wonderful thing. It can be a very costly and time-consuming thing, but it is changing the way and manner in which we act and interact. And one of the main reasons why consolidation is happening in the nonprofit space. It's allowing us to break down geographical boundaries. If you think about just the banking industry, something that we all have in common, I can do my banking and have a banking relationship with a small local bank in Boston, even if I live in California, because they have online capability, they have mobile capability. And the same thing in every nonprofit sector is we'll start to see more and more of the impacts of these technology organizations, of technology in general, on how we operate. In fact, one of the big things is it's blending industries. If you think of Amazon, Amazon is about 25 different industries in one company. So you really have to ask yourself, in the future, is there only going to be one industry, and that's technology? So we ask our clients a lot, should you consider becoming a technology company that delivers great service, versus a service company with good technology. Another big trend that's driving consolidation is just talent acquisition. So before COVID, there was a workforce crisis, and we're probably still experiencing some of the remnants of that, and that may shift over time. But another main factor that's driving consolidation is just the need to access new capabilities, new types of capabilities that maybe align with future strategic needs. And then because technology is advancing, it's disrupting or adding opportunity to the way and manner in which we can deliver service. And so it's affording the capabilities to do remote services or peer-to-peer services, which is a form of technology, interaction and delivery. And so a lot of organizations, if you're in, let's say, the human services space, and you have residential programming as well as day programming, your day programming might have been significantly disrupted by COVID-19 versus your residential programming, which may be a little bit more stable. And so how can that business model of the day programming evolve? How can you utilize remote capabilities, virtual capabilities, or technology solutions to relook at the way and manner in which you conduct that service? Obviously, one of the major things impacting everybody today is COVID-19. We're seeing this from a stress point on government budgets. The state is going to be in a deficit, which may lead to funding cuts in particular areas with particular program impact. There might be some programs that close. There might be a significant cut in the funding of those programs, and then an assessment as to whether they're viable or not. So these are things that COVID-19 is bringing to us. In addition, as Stratton had mentioned in the introduction, a lot of the donors and a lot of the foundations have really stepped up during this time, during this crisis. But that eventually down the road is going to lead to fundraising fatigue as well as a drain on resources. And these are just things that I think everyone needs to be aware of, because these are also factors that are going to push consolidation, partnerships, mergers, and affiliations. And then lastly, which is probably the biggest, is organizations that are in a state of emergency or urgency as it relates to the outcomes or impacts of COVID-19 and having to react very urgently, very quickly to maybe it's a threat to their financial existence, whether programs were cut, et cetera, or are in a state of crisis because of the amount of workforce that they've had to lay off. So COVID-19, obviously, as everybody knows, has had a huge impact. But one of the major factors that's driving consolidation is strategic growth. Okay, so what do I mean by strategic growth? I mean two things: that the market is oversaturated with nonprofits, and that nonprofits are getting significant in terms of size. So let's take a look. In the United States alone, there's 1.5 million nonprofits, and about 1 million of those are 501c3s, right? So there's a significant amount of organizations in this country. But even if we were to boil that down into just looking at Massachusetts, in Massachusetts alone, there's 33,000 nonprofits, right? And 26,000 of those are 501c3s. So for a state with 6.9 million people, there's roughly 200-ish nonprofits for every person in the state, right? So that's what I mean by market saturation, is there's a lot of nonprofits, but you also have to look at the complexity of that many nonprofit organizations in the market. That's 26,000 potential organizations that may be dealing with the state. So that's relationships that the state has to manage, and that's a lot of them. And maybe those organizations all have different IT systems or recording systems or the way they track data. So a lot of things are fragmented when it comes to these relationships or just the system of nonprofits. And so it becomes very complex when you look at how many organizations are in here. Even from a philanthropic standpoint, that's 26,000 people, 26,000 organizations going after the same donors and the same foundations. So market saturation is a key element that's leading to consolidation. The other is the financial size that some nonprofits are achieving. There are some nonprofits out there that are 50, 100, 200 plus $1 million, even hitting the $1 billion range if you're going to enter into higher ed and healthcare. Those are substantial size organizations. And then there's small ones that may have a budget of 100,000, 500,000, et cetera. And so when you get to be these medium to large size organizations, organic growth might not be a viable means anymore. And what I mean by that is, if I'm a $100 million organization and I want to start a new program, but I only know that's going to yield $250,000, $500,000 in revenue, then I might reconsider my strategy of going out and acquiring, merging, affiliating with maybe a $5 to $10 million organization that can bring that new program in-house, existing, already running, proven model, right? So financial size is a major factor leading to consolidation. And I just wanted to give you those trends as the context as we go in to talk about some of these models and options that you have. So in this section, we're going to dive into talking about, first, we're just going to cover decision-making at a high level and why that's important, and I'll give you a little bit more context on the next slide. But we're going to talk about a shared services model, the management company model, divestitures and closures, mergers and affiliations. And all of these are different options that you have in your strategy toolbox. So when we dive into decision-making, the reason for this slide and the reason to talk about decision-making and frankly, some of the stuff that we're going to talk about moving forward is so that you can be intentional about crafting the strategy for your organization so that you're proactive and thinking through some of these landscape changes and how you'll respond to them, right? Or to be prepared strategically to be responsive to an organization that might approach you. Right? The idea behind this is just to be prepared, but it's also to do what's in the best interest of your organization. And the sooner you start these conversations, if these things are relevant to you, the better, because that starts to educate the board, educate the leadership team. And when things do come your way or you start to implement, you'll be more well prepared to deal with the pace of which things come. So before we jump into the actual specific models, I want to just familiarize you with that there's two ways to look at these models through two different lenses. One is the level of autonomy each one affords you, and the other is the depth and level of integration and how much capacity and bandwidth that may take. So if we look at mergers are going to produce no autonomy because two organizations are coming together, and then there's only one surviving entity, so there is no autonomy between the organizations. And then when we look at integration on the merger side, a merger is going to be a significant heavier lift to integrate all of the organization's operations and everything versus a shared partnership, a shared service, or a partnership. The level of integration is a lot less. And you're also maintaining two separate entities, so the autonomy by which you can operate is higher. And there's pros and cons to both. All right, so let's dive in. Let's look at the first model, which is the shared services model. And for this example, I just used 4 organizations. It could be 2, it could be 3, it could be 10. But in this model, I just picked 4 for no particular reason. And so the idea behind a shared services model is that one organization, usually the larger or maybe the one with the stronger administrative functions. And we say administrative functions, we mean human resources, finance, information technology, those types of things. These organizations come together. Organization 1 has the stronger back office operations and decides to share those services with 2, 3, and 4. Thus, organizations 2, 3, and 4 are purchasing services, let's say HR services, from organization 1, so they don't have to go out and they don't have to acquire that talent themselves, which may be more costly. So when we look at the benefits of a shared services model, one of the benefits is cost savings, in that you don't have to go out and pay for that level of talent that you might be able to leverage at a sponsoring organization like organization 1. It also, a shared services model can be a stepping stone to deeper relationships that can lead to partnerships, that can lead to more even mergers and affiliations, more closer tie between the organizations. It's also a great way to increase capacity. If you're in organization 2, 3, and 4, you may have been spending a lot of time in some of these areas, but they may not be your specialty, HR, finance, et cetera, and having a skill set that can handle those at a much higher, more professional level might increase your own capacity within those organizations. Some of the big drawbacks are the lines of accountability are really hard to manage and define as it relates to these. I mean, if you think about it, if organization 2 moves their financial services, or all of them move their financial services into organization 1, how does the reporting structure work? What's the management look like of that, and where are the lines of accountability? One of the other big drawbacks is these smaller organizations, 2, 3, and 4, may be used to certain IT systems, human resource systems, or financial management systems, and they may have to get familiar with with organization 1 that is conducting the shared services. So this is just the start of one of the models. And to dive into the next one, management company is an example of another model that organizations can use. And in this case, 4 organizations coming together may decide they want to form a new company. And that new company is what's called a member-based LLC. LLC stands for Limited Liability Company. The idea is these organizations would have some sort of ownership percentage within that organization, and maybe they would purchase HR services, finance services, or IT services from this organization. There's a great one in Boston as an example called OPCO, and they work with CDCs throughout the state, and they support them in HR, finance, and IT services. And there are some significant benefits to this. It does increase your buying power, right? Because 4 organizations now can afford the buying power of the collective. It expands their systems capability because they can afford maybe more complex, more advanced systems of management. And they're also able to access talent that maybe one individual organization couldn't afford on their own. But some of the drawbacks to this are the percent ownership. So if organization 1 is 50 million, organization 2 and 3 are 10 million, and then organization 4 is 30 million. You might find that those percentages allocate in terms of ownership as well as 50%, 10%, 10%, and 30%. So in addition, there is an added cost given the LLC is a separate entity. So there is an added cost to managing that entity and ensuring that it is staffed appropriately to serve the network of organizations below it. And one of the other drawbacks is that you can exit this. We'll talk a little bit about the legal contracts as it relates to a management company, but if organization 4 would no longer want to buy services from the LLC, from the network, it could exit that. Obviously, there would be a significant amount of things to unwind in terms of the relationship to be able to do that, but there is that ability to move on. So if we dive into the next model, and unfortunately, this is something I would not have traditionally put in a PowerPoint deck, but because the sobering realities of COVID-19, divestitures and closures is something that a lot of organizations are talking about. So a divestiture, just for a little definition purposes, is when an organization looks to take one of their programs or services and transfer it to another provider that may be able to better support it. And then a closure, obviously, if something is no longer viable, having to shut it down. Right. So the benefits to conducting divestitures and closures is obviously you're going to minimize your loss, which will lead to reducing your risk, and thus expanding your capacity. Because typically, if you have a program or a service that's in a state of emergency, you're going to spend a lot of time there. It's going to consume a lot of your energy, which you'll get back in a divestiture or closure. But some of the big drawbacks are, yes, you will downsize. You'll have a smaller organization. You may have to deal with a significant level of communication with stakeholders that are involved in this, from those that you serve to those impacted to those that just pay attention to what's going on in your organization. And then you may have to reshape some of the infrastructure or reorg, downsize staff, or just shuffle things around, which has an impact on operations. And unfortunately, this is a reality of today, depending upon how funding and programs are impacted over the coming months and year. Mergers and so we're going to jump into mergers and affiliations next and talk through these both in a little bit more detail, because we're seeing a lot of mergers as well as affiliations. A merger is when 2 organizations come together, 2 separate 501c3 entities, and then one organization survives. Typically, the surviving entity is going to be either the larger one, or it's going to be the one that has the most complex contracts to be able to transfer. If there's a lot of transfer issues with certain types of state-funded contracts or federal-funded contracts, if there's a more in-depth banking relationship, and maybe there's bond financing or certain financing that limits your opportunity to transfer that ownership structure. That has a lot of influence into what entity will survive. But if we're dealing with two organizations, one's 10 million and one's 1 million, typically the 10 million will be the surviving entity. But the benefits of the merger is there's larger cost savings than any of the other models because you're forced into integrating both organizations into one immediately. So it is full commitment. Once you sign the final contract and the articles of merger are filed, you are one organization, no longer two. And also one of the benefits is its standardization. You know, you standardize policies and procedures much quicker than the other models because you're forced into that level of integration. One of the big drawbacks is you have to deal with brand, board, and leadership, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. And then also the deal time and integration will be significantly longer or probably more involved than the other models. So what I mean by deal time and integration, deal time is the time it takes to transact or get to the close from when you first start the conversation. And then integration time is once the merger is closed and you're now one organization, how long it takes to integrate the cultures. And that can vary if you have an organization that is 10 million and they are merging with an organization that's 500,000. The deal time and the integration time are probably going to be very, very short versus in comparison to if you had two $10 million organizations merging, because they're equal size or of like size, it's going to take more time. And mergers are too complex for more than two organizations to be involved at the table. I know with affiliations or shared services or even the management company, you can have multiple stakeholders or multiple organizations that you might be talking to at once. Whereas mergers are much too complex because of that to have more than two at the table. So coming back to the drawbacks, the three big obstacles to merger are brand, board, and leadership. So, I mean, let's take brand for example. Brand we're going to look at from two lenses. By the way, when two organizations are merging, there's only one surviving brand. And the way that we've seen organizations handle that is if they're of like size, typically they're marrying their brands together, called a bridge brand, right? And then at some point in time are going to go through a rebrand where they are coming up with maybe even a new name, new logo, new look and feel. And that's actually something they would do as a joint exercise to kind of bring the organizations together to unify the culture. So it's a great way to kind of get people engaged about the future of what the new entity is going to be. The other way is that if it is a large entity merging with a smaller one, typically the larger brand is going to win out in that conversation. But there's a lot of emotion tied with brands and brand names, but I just want to point that out, that's one major obstacle to consider. The second is the board of directors. Let's say you have two organizations merging and they both have boards of 15 and 15. So when you merge, are you going to maintain a board of 30? So if you're like size organizations or similar size organizations, you may have the opportunity to say, we're just going to bring both organizations together, have a big board, manage attrition, or a few board members from each side have agreed to step off, and therefore we'll close the merger with a board of 20. If it's a large entity merging with a small one, typically what we've seen is a proportion or percentage offered to the smaller to say, we have a board of 15, and given that you're a third, 2/3 or a third our size, we'll have 5 board members come over. And we'll use that as part of the term sheet, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The biggest one of them all, the biggest hurdle of them all is leadership, and particular the executive director, the CEO. And so when we say leadership is that when two organizations come together, there's only one surviving CEO. And this is a very tough conversation to have. So the mergers that we've actually facilitated to date have all had outgoing CEOs or CEOs that were retiring, which afforded that opportunity to kind of step in and propose a merger opportunity. So if there's two CEOs that don't intend to retire, this conversation gets very sticky and may take a little bit of a different turn. But these are the 3 big obstacles that lead to mergers. And so we're going to cover the deal implementation around these in a little bit, but I want to compare and contrast mergers to I would say rising in popularity model affiliations. So a merger, two organizations come together, one remains. In an affiliation, one organization assumes the role of the sole member or parent company, and the other assumes the role as the subsidiary. Typically what we see is the one that assumes the role as the parent is the larger, or the one with the more in-depth back office operations. So to take a deeper look at these, because you're keeping two separate entities that are affiliated, which pretty much means you're locked in as one organization, you maintain two separate entities. And maybe that subsidiary would transfer the administrative functions up to an organization. So if, you know, a large museum wanted to affiliate with smaller museums, what they might say as a value proposition is, hey, you can leverage our finance department, our HR department, our IT department, and get very sophisticated services, and we can support you if you come into our network as a subsidiary, right? The great thing about affiliations is they preserve or get around those big obstacles in a merger. They get around the brand, the board, and the leadership issues. Because you're keeping two separate entities, therefore you can have two separate brands, you can have your two separate boards, and you can preserve both of the CEOs as part of this transaction. Another great thing is you maintain local autonomy. So if one organization is based in Boston proper and the other is on the North Shore, two very different demographics and potential populations served, having two separate entities helps to preserve that local look and feel, that local autonomy. This is a very flexible, dynamic, adaptable model. A lot of things can happen in this. In fact, I could give another hour and a half webinar just on affiliations and the depth of what you can do with them. But one of the major benefits to point out is that it can absorb rapid growth. You can grow very, very quickly using this model, and I'll show you what I mean by that on the next slide. But some of the drawbacks are you're much slower to achieve cost savings using this model because you technically don't have to integrate anything, or you can take your time and integrate over a period of years. Unlike a merger, you're forced into kind of achieving those cost savings right out of the gate. If you are doing any level of integration, one of the other drawbacks is you'll probably be doing that with your administrative functions, which will be restructured. One of the big obstacles in an affiliation is getting the subsidiary comfortable with that, with the fact that their board of directors, the powers will be limited around things like budget approval and maybe hiring the CEO, capital expenditures, and things of that nature. So the subsidiary would have to go through the parent for some of those decisions. And that's just a change and something to be aware of, and probably one of the bigger obstacles in an affiliation. Another big drawback is cohesive messaging and brand. If you look at this affiliated network, there might be two totally different brand names, right? And so how do you reconcile that over time? Healthcare uses the affiliation model quite a bit. So if you think of Partners Healthcare, you think of Wellforce, et cetera, their sole member would be kind of that parent organization, and then the hospitals would be their subsidiaries. How do you connect the brands of the hospital to the network? And that's really important over time, is so that you start to standardize that look and feel. All right, so as I mentioned before, affiliation is flexible and dynamic, and you can grow really fast using this model. And so let's say that this is phase one, and phase one is that organization one is the sole member and organization two is the subsidiary, and they close the transaction, and boom, they are now affiliated. But organization one says, I want to grow the network in 5 years very fast. They could look at adding a third organization, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, all the way up, and rapidly grow and never touch integration, never integrate any of the entities, but just hold them as an affiliated network until they get to a certain size where they can then focus on integrating certain functions. One of the other strategies is they can create a parent corporation, that NewCo, that will serve as that back office administrative function, and then organization one drops down as a subsidiary, or it just goes on as the sole member in perpetuity. So this type of model can absorb a significant amount of growth, is very flexible. You can do a whole bunch of different things in it. One of the other major benefits is, and I'll give healthcare as an example. If I have a hospital in Lowell, a hospital in Boston, and then a hospital out in Springfield, they're all under my network as a parent corporation, this phase 4 NewCo. They have all different salary structures because the market salaries are very different from Boston to Springfield, Massachusetts. But if I hold them as separate entities, I don't have to have a standardized or unified comp plan. Each entity, because they're separate entities, can have their own. So again, that's just one example of many that are benefits towards this affiliation growth strategy. So I want to pause here and see if Stratton, we've got a couple questions, maybe take 4 or 5 minutes worth of questions. And so, by the way, we're going to go through kind of how and where to begin, which is coming up next, and then deal implementation. But anything on some of the things that we've gone through or covered so far?
Yeah, Eric, we had a couple, particularly around affiliation, a couple questions that came up just now. So one was around, is an affiliation what we'd usually refer to as a fiscal agent, or what is the sort of mix and match or difference of, when we say fiscal agent and the responsibility of fiscal agent versus an affiliation?
Sure. So fiscal agent is more towards the shared services model, right? You're contracting with another organization that will do your back office books or do your finances, et cetera. An affiliation is that it's of the commitment level of a merger, right? You are fully affiliated as one network legally, which means your articles of organization will change, your bylaws will change as a result of that. And you don't see that with a fiscal agent. With a fiscal agent, you're just contracting services. So that's more of the shared services model.
Terrific. That's a great distinction. And there was a question regarding, you mentioned some of the sort of as a downside, some of the limitations of the board dynamic and the board responsibility and authority. And you gave some examples, but there's a question, how much flexibility there is if you are a subsidiary board. Does it have to lose all of those sort of, by law or some of the fiduciary responsibilities, or is that really up to the affiliation agreement and, such as hiring the CEO and some of the things that people on boards would imagine are sort of their primary responsibility? So how much flexibility is there?
Sure. So that's a really good question. The first thing to start out with is a lot of times what we see is in an affiliation agreement is the subsidiary will actually have an agreement with the parent upon the close to put a couple board members on the parent, and maybe the parent puts a couple on the subsidiary. Again, the idea behind this is to start the integration process culturally at the board levels. But when we look at the limiting governance powers, it depends on, and again, because it's so flexible and dynamic, you can have a lot of negotiation weight in there, but there are some core things that any parent organization would want to make sure either they have control of or at least have veto power around. And, capital expenditures, budgets, or who they bring in as leadership are probably key components of that.
So you could establish a model where there's some veto power, but sort of some independent authority. So as long as it's aligned with the mission and the strategy and et cetera, there's some independence there.
Yep.
While because it's part of a larger parent, the parent still has some overall responsibility. Okay.
Exactly.
One other question was, some of the examples you were giving were sort of larger organizations doing some of this work, whether it's in shared services or affiliations or and looking at sort of some of the benefits. Do you have any examples, and without naming names necessarily, but sort of organizational benefits or very sort of tangible, tactical things that you've seen in smaller organizations where they've seen some of this benefit through collaboration, whether through shared services or through affiliations or et cetera, that are things that for smaller boards or smaller leaderships to be thinking about how do they maximize their mission effectiveness?
Sure. No, it's a good question when you get down to, what are the outcomes that you want to achieve, and it's a very complex process with a lot of complex decision making that's involved, because when we talk about economies of scale, when we talk about cost savings and the benefits of those things, we're usually talking about redundant positions, right, in a merger, or redundant positions in affiliation if we're centralizing everything. So if one of the goals of a board through strategic planning is cost savings, and they're looking at these models as a way of achieving that, that usually means that they're offsetting someone's responsibilities or replacing that with different levels. And so the decision making around it can be very, very challenging and very emotional, because a lot of organizations, especially small ones, have very engaged boards and things like that. And so if they're looking at really the pressures of having to cut costs, this is the way to do that, but it doesn't come without some challenge.
Yeah, terrific. So do you want to move on to the next section, and we'll capture some more of these questions and come back to them if we have time?
Yeah, so this next section is really just about, okay, that's great. You told me the models, you told me the trends that are happening in the world within these. So, what do we do now? I'm an organization listening to this webinar. I want to bring this conversation back and figure out what to do. And so there's a couple different things, and we're going to kind of go through how do you engage your board and your team, defining your current reality, making sure everybody's on the same page with that, as well as looking at what do you need for the future, then how do you go and find these organizations and connect with them, and then actually get a deal. So I can't stress this enough. It is very important to engage your board from the start, regardless of your thoughts about engaging the board. I know a good example, and I won't say any names, but an organization got involved with a merger. They did not engage their board from the beginning, and the board got to a specific point, having just found out about it, and ended the deal, ended the discussion. And you don't want that. And your board is a key stakeholder in any merger, affiliation, or strategic partnership, and they should be involved from the beginning. And the way you can get them involved in just thinking about this concept or these concepts is to form a task force. Two or three board members, 2 or 3 staff members, and you talk about what the process is, which are going to be some of the next slides here. How do we get organized around even thinking about what we need, want, et cetera, strategically, and then agree to a pace. And what I mean by that is, if you are going after mergers, affiliations, or any of these strategic partnerships, you want to be in communication with how aggressive a board and a CEO or executive director can be in the process. Meaning, can the CEO go out and speak to 5 organizations at once? Can they try to strike up as many deals as possible, or connect with as many organizations as possible? What level of pace do you want to run at here? How aggressive do you want to be? And then lastly is on the communication side, how is the executive director and the senior team going to be communicating with the task force and going to be communicating back to the board? Setting those things up from the beginning is going to be really important. But a way to dive in once you have this task force established is about defining the current situation. Get everybody on board with the same reality of what's going on. Right? And this is important because then you'll all be starting or taking a step forward from the same place. So when we look at, what are the strengths and weaknesses of our programs? What programs do we have to leverage? What programs do we have gaps that we need to fill? Same on the operations side, right? Or on the financial side, are we really financially strong? We have a good cash reserve. We can afford some risk. We have the ability to embark on this. Are we in a financial crisis in any way, shape, or form? These give you a little bit of your leverage points, but also really define what your world looks like. How are we looking on capacity? Do we have any excess capacity anywhere? Or are we totally underwater in certain areas that might make an important fact to know about going into any of these transactions? Do we need new types of skill sets? Are we weak in certain areas or strong? And then how about technology? Where do we need technology? Where are we strong? Where are we weak? Is that something that we need from a potential partner, et cetera? So this almost becomes a mini strategic planning process. And you're going to start by defining your current reality. Get everybody on board, from the task force to the board, to say, yep, this is the strengths and weaknesses of the organization. And then from there, you want to start planning for the future. Again, this is about being intentional with your organization. And what do you need? What's the future need of the organization? Do we need to diversify our revenue stream because we've got too many eggs in one basket? Do we need to expand our value chain of service to serve birth to death with the clientele that we serve? Do we need to achieve economies of scale, cost savings, so that we can have some margin either to increase our wages of our staff or to maybe invest in a little bit of innovation? Do we want to expand to new geographies because we know our territory is saturated right now? We kind of own the market. Or do we just need to get bigger to be relevant? I mean, we hear a lot about this with state funders, is that they want to transact with these larger agencies. So what size do you need to be in your sector to really be relevant, to have enough bandwidth and capacity or resources to operate? And then tech investments. As I mentioned before, technology can be the greatest thing, it can be the worst thing in terms of time and resources. But if you need to make any investments in anywhere, is that something that's needed, or are you fine in that department? And then lastly, are you in a state of emergency? Does that trump all these other things in that you have to do something immediately? And that's really the only strategic need, because that's important to know as well. And knowing the current realities as well as what your strategic need is in the future will help you get to a point where you can source opportunities and reach out to other organizations. So we're going to talk a little bit just about how to put together this construct of partners to be able to look at types of organizations, whether you want a merger, affiliation with, or just you want to be able to respond to somebody that's coming to you, just different lenses you can look at things through. And then maybe how to prioritize some of those partners, and then how do you strike up a conversation for outreach. But before we get into this, I really want you to understand that there's kind of this risk profile that goes along with any of these mergers, affiliations, or shared services, management company, et cetera. And that has to do with your growth strategy and the risk associated with that. So when we look at going after or connecting with potential partners that are in our target markets that we operate geographically, that provide the same types of services or do the same types of things that we do, our risk is a lot less because we know that playing field. There's more known factors there. But as we move over towards the right-hand side, if we're entering a new market, new geography, we're expanding our services to areas that we don't know, there's more unknown factors, so the risk increases. And this is just important because when we get into putting together a partner matrix, right, if you're looking at being proactive about this and going out and finding organizations, whether that's organizations that you want to partner with or want to approach maybe from a state of emergency to get help from, this is a great way to kind of prioritize and triage a list of organizations. And many CEOs, executive directors, they know a lot of the agencies, the nonprofits that are out there, synergistic type organizations that you can list as these candidates, right? And this is by no means an all-encompassing partner matrix. In fact, it's much more involved spreadsheet, but just to kind of fit it on the screen so you would get a summarized profile here. Getting out and finding these organizations and who they are, and you could probably quickly off the cuff get several names listed down as to organizations that you might want to open doors and have conversations with, and then coming up with several more might require some more research. But being able to put a candidate profile together to so that everyone can see, when I say everyone, this task force or even the board or just yourself in going through decision making, where they're focused programmatically. What do their assets look like? What's their cash position look like? Do they have a significant amount of liabilities? Is their revenue strong? Are their expenses good? What geographical territory do they operate? This helps create that profile so you understand who they are and how they're operating. And then again, throwing the risk analysis in there so you kind of understand what level of risk this might entail. And then going back to your strategic needs list and populating this section with whatever detail that you might be looking for from an organization or from strategic growth will help populate this. And then it just kind of checking the boxes to see how the organization aligns to fulfilling the most of your needs. And what you should get from this is a list of about 3 to 5 different organizations that you would say are the top priorities that you would want to approach. And maybe you want to approach them as to be taken over, to be acquired, so to speak. Or maybe you want to approach them with the intent to merge or affiliate, or maybe that you only need one thing. You need financial support, so you want to approach them with shared services around financial fiscal management. Before you do any of this, though, in looking at those organizations, you want to get board approval or task force approval to move forward. Again, everything's in communication with and everything is engaging the board. I can't overstate that enough. It's really important. But outreach can start as, I've had most of the mergers that we have done have started over a cup of coffee. Hey, can we get together over a cup of coffee? Whether that's in person or virtual, I leave that risk to you. And the conversation can consist, really high level as to, why we're here, why we're having this discussion. What's the strategic reasons that we think you'd be a valued partner? Here's what we think our strengths or what we could leverage to be of value for you, and here's what we see as your value to us, right? And then you're kind of just gauging the reaction of the leader that you're speaking with at the table at that time, and seeing what they say, and then leaving that discussion with a series of next steps. And the next step might be thanks but no thanks, or it might be let's continue the conversations. And those conversations will evolve. Those discussions will keep progressing and progressing. But eventually they're going to hit okay, let's explore something. And you kind of have a model in mind as to what you're going to explore. And then both sides have a task force, and you form a steering committee, maybe made up of 2 to 3 board members from each side and 2 to 3 staff from both sides. And you talk about the timelines by which you want to close this and then formalize the deal. And we're going to talk about these things in much more in depth in the next section. But you really want to just get the conversations going with someone, but that someone is really important. You want that to have strategic value, and thinking through who those conversations might be is going to be really important. So I want to just pause here to see if we have any questions. We're going to talk about deal implementation next and kind of dive into the details of what that looks like. But this is just a high level of maybe ways that you can prepare yourself. So if you have any questions, throw them in the chat, and Stratton, I'll let you read them off.
Yeah, terrific. We've had a bunch of good questions coming in, both publicly and to me directly. And one of the questions was interesting when you talked about sort of the risk tolerance and sort of the even the framework of how you evaluate these. One of the questions was around how you feel about merger affiliations of 2 sort of unlike organizations or mutually reinforcing organizations to either share services or create mutual value, such as an art association with a museum or a museum with a performance center, or basically 2 sort of product lines or 2 services coming together. What are some of the things to think about when you're evaluating that? What would be some of the key sort of considerations?
Sure. So we are actually seeing a lot of that right now. We are seeing a lot of this concept of diversification. And I'll give it a specific example. An agency that might have served the IDD, or intellectual and developmental disabilities community, realizing that we are not an IDD organization, we are a human services organization. And so that opens them up to elder services and veterans and homeless, and a huge umbrella of potential that they would be looking at. And so we're seeing the diversification strategy go that way. And if there's synergy between a museum and an art organization that has a potential there, that may make a lot of sense depending upon how you would, program one into the other, and what that would look like. And, is there a way to look at who you serve and maybe some of the customers that are coming, and, are there complementary customers that overlap there, or people that you serve overlap there, et cetera? Because that automatically creates some like a catalyst for growth if you're serving kind of a common population.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You sort of, that type of mutual reinforcing situation. You can look at it on both sides of the ledger. One on the cost side, like, is there a way to sort of reduce costs either through sort of physical location and plant, or through some of the overhead and some of the shared services you've talked about before? But then really what's interesting about the mutual reinforcing is also to consider the ability to enhance your actual sort of delivery of your mission and sort of the impact of your work by sharing audience lists or delivering multiple services to the same audience in a way that's more effective in some way. And then you also, if you're based on sort of program fees or et cetera, that could be very effective.
Yep.
If you're based on sort of fundraising models, you have to understand what are the implications now. Are you fundraising going to the same person for 2 asks versus what, trying to go to them separately, the pros and cons of that. So it's interesting. It's complicated stuff, but the mutual reinforcing ones have a lot of, additional potential versus just sort of cost savings type thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of synergies there, a lot of potential alignment and things that would kind of need to be worked out in the implementation plan.
Yeah, but certainly very interesting. The second one was a question around sort of the threshold for what size an organization should be or should consider being if you're going to be a parent of another, or do you need to be bigger? Do you need to be smaller? Do you need to be really big? Can you be small? As far as being a parent or looking to affiliate in some capacity, how would you think about that? Does size matter?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends. I mean, again, because the affiliation model is so dynamic and flexible, 2 small organizations could enter into an affiliation. The challenge that exists is because 2 small organizations are entering into affiliation, you're now not achieving the economies of scale because you're doing less integration. You're spending money on 2 separate brands. They're very small, so they're going to remain kind of disjointed. It may be more viable for smaller organizations to consider a merger as an option, or looking at working with a larger organization. But in human services, what we've heard is we've heard that $40 million is kind of like the number, which I know is huge, for organizations that the state may want to get involved with. Because again, coming back to the capabilities around technology and more importantly, technology integration and the use of person-centered planning and things like that, that's going to become more of a factor in decision-making when contracts are put to bid and things of that nature. But if you're 2 small organizations and you're considering get together, it really depends upon the dynamic and what you want to achieve out of it, because, one model might be right over the other just from what you want to try to accomplish. So it really depends. I mean, again, the affiliation is so flexible and dynamic. You can do about 1 million different things with it.
And I think, if you're a small organization looking to, absorb a subsidiary or looking to sort of bring someone in, you need to ask yourselves the questions around sort of what's that work going to entail? And do we have the capacity for that? or do we have the talent and skill to do that? So,
yeah.
And
we'll dive into some of what the work will entail in the next section.
Right. Some of the questions to think about, right? It doesn't matter necessarily if you're big or small. It's just more of, do you have the capacity and the skill? And then I don't know if you're going to talk more about sort of the cultural impact or the need to evaluate sort of cultural differences as you think about mergers, affiliations, and et cetera. But obviously that's a big one too. And you've touched on that a little bit with leadership and board and things like that. And I don't know if you want to tackle that now, Eric, or if you want to hold off on that and tackle that in a little bit.
Yeah, I'll tackle that when we get to strategic integration. And if I don't, kind of loop back with me at the end on that.
Perfect.
Great. About it, but I'll try to touch upon it there.
Great.
All right. Awesome. So as we dive in, right, the idea behind this next section, which is the last section, is that you have found somebody through your outreach or who has come to you and said, I'd like to do something with you. What do? How does transacting a deal look like? What are the agreements and terms that you want to do? What's due diligence? What does that mean? What does it look like? How do you prepare for the closing to ensure you're ready? And then, what legal documents am I going to incur? So in this section, we're going to dive into some of that. But again, you'll hear a common theme here. And one of the first things, if you haven't done it already, if you're being responsive or someone comes to you and just engages you out of the blue in a conversation, again, you want to assemble your team. You want to get representatives from your board as well as your senior leadership team from both sides. So if it's 2 organizations in a merger affiliation, those are probably 2 more relevant ones. Put together a team. If it's a shared service or if it's a LLC management company, that might be something the staff can do or present because you're really buying services from a different organization. But when you're dealing with mergers and affiliations, you want to have two different teams come together so that they can work together and talk through what the meeting schedule is going to be and some of the work and the capacity that's going to take. Because if you're talking about a merger, there might be a significant amount of time that it takes from board members, and they need to know those things up front, right? But regardless of starting any deal, whatever it is, you want to have the difficult conversations first. Okay, and the reason being is the next phase, the due diligence phase, right? We'll talk about the agreements and the terms in a second, but the due diligence phase costs a lot of time and takes the most, costs a lot of money, takes the most amount of time. And so getting these challenging conversations done up front is going to be important. So what's a challenging conversation? Okay, well, if we're looking at an LLC management company model, it might be who's the CEO of the management company. If we're talking about mergers, it might be brand, board, and leadership. If it's an affiliation, it might be who's the parent, who's the subsidiary, or what's the reduced governance powers of the subsidiary. So these are good to have facilitators help you talk through because, again, they can be difficult. But a great way to start the difficult conversations is when you bring the steering committee, this group of board members from both organizations, this group of leaders from both organizations together, is talk about first, what's our vision and goals for this type of deal, regardless of what it is, right? What do we want to achieve out of this? What's our collective, what we want to achieve out of this? What's the model we want to use? Do we want to use affiliation? Do we want to use a merger, something different, etc.? Once you do that, you'll start to get an understanding of the types of terms that you'll need to put together, right? And the terms are really consider those the hard conversations, and you're tackling those up front. So if we say we pick an affiliation, well, let's talk about, so that we can include in our first agreement together, let's talk about who's the parent and what some of those governance powers are going to be that are reduced. So that at least you get that conversation out of the way, and you have that before you start the due diligence, because you'd hate to be at the closing table signing a contract when another party isn't sure that they want to be the subsidiary. That can be a little challenging given how much time and bandwidth these things take. So again, some of the terms and agreements and things that you'll get done up front is the timelines. When do we expect to close this? And that's important to identify, is because you need an end date so that you can project manage everything backwards from. Not only that, is a lot of organizations will tend to close a merger or affiliation, anything major restructurally changing their organization at a fiscal year end. Maybe they do it at a calendar year end. We've seen some even do it at a quarter end. It really depends on what's the ideal target date, which many different factors contribute to. And that's important because if you're funded by the state, some state funding agencies will require 60 or 90 days formal notification because they themselves will have some work that you'll have to do for them. Right? And then you always take this, the visions and goals of the organization and the strategic model and the terms that you've agreed to and these timelines, and you put them into a very informal document, which is a letter of intent or memorandum of understanding, LOI or MOU. And the idea behind this is to formally consummate the start of the deal. Now, LOI or MOU is a really simple document. It pretty much just states that we're going to maintain confidentiality for this transaction, and we'll announce to the public or whoever when we're both in agreement to that, that we might operate exclusively with one another. We won't go be seeking other candidates while we're in discussions. And then the terms of the agreement. And then it will also say that any party can back out upon formal written notice at any time for any reason. So it's a very non-binding contract other than confidentiality that kind of carries on. But it's a way to formalize and kick off the process. And you want that level of commitment before you jump into the next phase, which is due diligence. And this is where you're going to do the most amount of work. Now, due diligence can be as high level or as in-depth as you want it. It's really up to the organization. And so it's going to cover a lot of different categories. And this is kind of when you're investigating your potential partner and who they are, and you're kind of diving deep in a bunch of different areas. So The first thing that you're going to do in due diligence is, you're going to probably contract, if you don't have one already, an attorney. I can't state this enough, that it's really important to work with one that's been there, done that with mergers, affiliations, or strategic partnerships or management companies before, so that one, you have peace of mind, but they're able to adhere to the different things that they need to in terms of timelines, filings, etc. In addition, to be able to support you in the sector that you work in, which may require contract review and things like that with funders. Having a legal team, and there's a lot out there that do this type of work, is vitally important. So the next piece is governance. And upon the first thing that you have to have in place upon the close, once the transaction closes, if it's a merger or an affiliation, is a governance structure that must be in place. And so that means a new set of bylaws, new articles, if those things are being amended, changed, dropped, etc. If one organization is merging into another, you'll be utilizing one surviving set of bylaws. And so in addition to governance being restructured as any part of a merger or affiliation, it's not really touched in shared services or management company model. But in addition to that, one major thing that you want to pay attention to in any merger or any affiliation is whether or not your bylaws, your governance structure has membership. And when I say membership, I mean membership other than your board of directors, governing membership, or governance membership, excuse me. If it does, that can create added hoops to be able to jump through, and things that you just need to be aware of as you project manage this out. I'm not going to get into what membership governance is because it's a very detailed conversation. But in addition, HR and benefits, you'll be looking and comparing the different benefits to each other. If it's a merger affiliation, most likely you'll be adopting one set of benefits over another. And so this is something that is really important to be able to communicate with staff when the timing is right. We've worked with a very large organization that merged with a smaller organization, and the smaller one, all their benefits were changing. However, they were changing for the better. But just because they were changing, and there were so many unknowns because it's so complex and there's not a lot of trust right out of the gate, it's very, the staff were very upset about the benefits change, even though they were receiving a better package. Due diligence also consists of financial analysis, diving in to check what the current state of their financial situation is, from the cash they may have on hand to their investments, to their liabilities, what's their debt obligations, are those contracts that can transfer under new ownership, etc. Are they fiscally sound? Is there anything to be aware of? Any kind of fraud, any lawsuits outstanding, etc. So it can be, again, as deep as you want it to be. And again, the deeper you go, obviously, the more time or cost that will incur. And some people may use their CPA firm to help them with some of the financial analysis. Then on the programs and services side, you're going to kind of look at which programs and services that they have in comparison to yours. Are they bringing any new to the table? How will you integrate programs of similar nature into the ones that you're doing? If it's a merger, how will you hold them? If it's an affiliation, how will you set up best practice to start standardizing some of those things if it's a huge infrastructure? And then operationally, looking at what the structure is going to be from an org chart perspective, as well as the types of systems being used. From the due diligence period, you're probably getting a list together of all IT systems and figuring out which ones are going to be the surviving. And so these all are, and again, your operational infrastructure might be Excel spreadsheets, but still, that's something that needs to be integrated with something else, and there is a process to that. So regardless of whether your organization is very large or very small, there's still factors that you need to consider when integrating or reviewing in the due diligence period. And so again, this is the part of the process that takes the most amount of time, and is going to probably cost the most amount of money with legal and maybe some financial, etc. All right. And so once the due diligence is done and you say, okay, we've done our investigation, we've looked at our potential partner, and we find that they are, this is a deal we still want to go forward with, you have to get ready for the closing. And there's three things that you want to get ready around, and one is governance, two is communication, and three is integration. So when we look at governance, I don't mean the due diligence side of governance. I mean, what are you going to do after the closing? So let's say January 1st, 2021, a merger happens and you are now one organization. So maybe you merge two boards of 15 together. Well, that's 15 and 15 people that you have to now socialize, that you have to educate, that you have to think about how to integrate into committees, right? Maybe you have to you've worked their terms out. So now you have to manage their terms of 30 board members, right? 30 relationships, 20 relationships, whatever the number. But there's a level of education and building a team and getting them socialized with each other so that they know and interact and understand this new agency, whether it's an affiliation or a merger, is critical. These are probably less, the governance plan is probably not applicable to the shared services and management company. And then communication plan. So there's really two types of communication plans. One is when you're going to announce the merger, and typically you would announce it before you close because you have to interact with certain funders, you need certain staff participation, et cetera. And you want to plan that out so it's timelined and orchestrated out. But then there's also after, when you close, the day you close. Do you have a new website? Do you need a new website? Do you have a new brand? Are you doing a relaunch, any public relations or any marketing blitz or anything like that? So there's, as part of the deal when you're transacting it and getting it to done, there's how you communicate with all your stakeholders to inform them about your intent and involve them in the process where they need to be involved. But then there's the big celebration, the big branding, the rebranding, whatever that may be, the marketing blitz that comes the day of the closing and immediately following. And then the integration plan. So during the due diligence and as you're working out this deal, you want to kind of link back to those strategic reasons. Why are we doing this in the first place? And to really understand how we're going to integrate. What did we agree to up front? What is the org structure going to look like of this? And that's really important with all the models that we went through, so that you're thinking through either the lines of responsibility, accountability, or the level of change that needs to occur. Right? And again, even small organizations, a lot of this will be overwhelming. So some of the legal documents that you'll experience in this process would be a letter of intent. And typically we see letters of intent mostly in mergers, okay? But they're kind of synonymous with MOUs, which is Memorandum of Understanding. But typically they would be something that would, encapsulate some general terms, or maybe not, but just to consummate the transaction, to kick it off, right? In a shared services model, you just might have an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, that defines the shared services relationship. And that might be all you need to kind of set the stage for the interaction of buying financial or HR services from another organization. But as things get more complex, as the deals get bigger or more complicated, so do the contracts. So if you're looking at an LLC management company, typically you'd have an operating agreement. In an operating agreement, you would have kind of the percent ownership or membership percentage of the organizations involved. You'd have, the terms and decision-making in there, as well as, how organizations can exit and all those other clauses that you would see. On the merger side, you would have a merger agreement or a definitive agreement. And that would be the actual contract you sign that has all the terms, conditions, the exhibits, the schedules, and the appendices to them, that encapsulates the entire transaction of the organization that you are merging into, becoming, et cetera, on both sides. And then upon the signing of that and the filing of the articles of merger, you are one organization. Affiliation agreement is very similar to a merger agreement, encapsulates all the terms of the deal, as well as who's involved and all the schedules, appendices, and things like that. So it's a very complex document, an involved, in-depth document, and upon the signing of that and the filing of the affiliation agreement, you are an affiliated network of organizations. So those are some of the legal documents that you might see. And so once you get to the signing and the deal has closed, congratulations, the real work begins, right? And so upon entering, the time when the deal closes, whether it's any of those models, you have to now implement to get the benefits of them. And this is where the real work begins. It's where really hard decisions enter into play, where a lot of bandwidth and capacity are going to be taken up to make this successful. And so when you're bringing cultures together, two organizations which are used to different leadership or different management or different processes and policies or just way of being, you have to really think intentionally about how you bring those together. Now, an affiliation model with culture, you don't really have to worry about culture if you're not doing a lot of integration. You can kind of slow play that. You have your time. But if you're dealing with mergers, culture becomes a huge factor because you want to make sure that there's some sort of synergies, and you would hash this out as part of the due diligence process between the two organizations culturally. And there's some certain things that you can look at to help assess that, and certain questions that you can ask that will start leading towards an understanding as to whether or not you can work with this group of individuals, this new type of culture as you go. But the integration is going to take quite a bit of time depending upon the type of model. And there's two lenses that you want to look at integration, and one is going to be the short term, the things that need to be done within the first few months, and a lot of that's going to be the communication stuff and just getting people to meet people, right? It's the relationship piece to bridge that gap that existed between two entities, right? And it's the long term. How do you bring those cultures together? Where are you going to standardize and unify, and what are you going to integrate first, and how does that pace out over a period of time? So, I know this was probably like drinking from the fire hose with regards to everything that we have gone through, and I'm sure that you're feeling that the pace of change out there in the marketplace in the nonprofit world is very overwhelming. I definitely feel that as well. And, I know that we're all in the same boat, and you guys do some tremendous work for a lot of the organizations that are on here. I know quite a few of the organizations that are participating here. I know you guys all do great work, and you're not alone in this journey. Everyone's kind of in the same boat. All of these market pressures just got amplified by COVID-19, and we're all kind of running this race together. But I really appreciate you spending time today on this webinar to learn about mergers, partnerships, affiliations. I'm deeply grateful to Essex County Community Foundation for partnering with me and us on this, and I'm very appreciative of my team and all the inspiration they have given me towards the content here. So again, this is the end of the webinar, but I welcome any questions in relationship to any of the 4 sections that we have gone through.
Yeah, absolutely, Eric. And you've been terrific on managing the time, which we are highly appreciative of. And so we still have about 5 or 10 minutes for a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap up and keep people moving on their day to other Zooms or other activities that they have today. But definitely a bunch more questions came up. You answered the one on sort of cultural impact, I think, and having sensitivity to that and understanding that, and really trying to include people in the process or understanding what the impact of that is, which is terrific. One of the things that you touched on earlier that sort of came up as a question and seems so critical in any of these sort of considerations is establishing a clear objective. What are we even trying to accomplish, right? Because there's so many different things that you can get caught up in the noise. And it seems like that might be the role of the task force, you talked about before, step 1, like, what is the objective? Like, what are we trying to do? Is it reducing costs? Is it, expanding sort of service and revenue potential, or expanding impact to our mission, sort of evolving our mission? You tell us a little bit about sort of, that process, the importance of that process, how that comes to be. How do people even get started to sort of establish that? And the importance of doing that up front versus,
Sure.
Getting down the road.
Sure. Yeah. It's so it's a great question. I'll answer it this way, in that whenever you have new CEOs coming into an organization, they typically conduct strategic planning within the first couple of years, and they do that to bring the team together, right? And so now you're dealing with two organizations sitting at a table, right? And they're both, coming from the standpoint of us versus them. There's something that needs to bring them together. And so one of the great things about doing kind of a mini strategic plan for the deal is to bring those two groups together in an activity where they have to participate together and come up with their strategic rationales as to why we're doing this. What objectives or goals do we want to achieve as a group together? It's also, I think, one of the benefits that we have in facilitating is to kind of help support the relationship versus the kind of us versus them dynamic. And it's really important as the number one thing that you do as a steering committee, as a group coming together, is embark on that journey together, because it'll tell you a lot about culturally about who you're working with, right? Just from how they participate and things like that. But it'll also give you those high level pictures, that vision, those goals that you can point back to when you get into maybe difficult or challenging conversations around a certain topic, and say, I know we're stuck on this topic, but does this tactic or topic trump our strategic rationale for doing this? And if it doesn't, then you have to find a workaround, right? Because that rationale is more important than small speed bumps along the way, but it gives you that. So that's a great question.
And another question that came up, Eric, was around sort of, in your experience, and you've touched on a lot of these, but to sort of, to synthesize it down, what are sort of 2 or 3 of the biggest gotchas? Like if people are sort of thinking about this, whether you're a small organization, a media organization, or a big organization, and you're thinking about starting this process very early on it and thinking about the different types and the different pros and cons and et cetera, what are some of the biggest gotchas they should be aware of as they embark on this? Things to avoid or things to be aware of as they move down that path.
Yeah. So as far as major pitfalls or obstacles that you want to kind of have a heads up on going into is that, and I know I beat this drum, is don't do it alone. Engage a team. Thinking that you're going to do something this big, this complex, without involving board and other staff stakeholders, it's just not going to go the way you planned. I think another big gotcha that we've seen a lot of that has just kind of, I would say, temporarily derailed us in mergers has been around board membership. So not board of directors, but if you have membership in your governance structure, that has often reared itself as a major obstacle and a major hurdle that we didn't discover until maybe partway through as to how big of a hurdle it was. So understanding that from the beginning is huge, because it does impact how you can, the pace at which you can move and the timelines at which you can move to meet your objectives in a merger or an affiliation.
Perfect. And then 2 more quick questions. One was around sort of, communicating, and you talked about communications, but, a lot of organizations like ourselves and others have multiple different constituencies and donors and things like that. What are some things to think about regarding the need for communication to those various constituencies and, the populations being served, the donors, et cetera, and being intentional about that?
Yeah, I don't think you understand how complex communication is until you map out all the stakeholder groups and who's going to communicate with them, how, and what you're going to do to get in front of them and things like that. And then compound that complexity with COVID-19, where you have to do it all virtually, right? And so I think the virtual thing has actually worked really well with communications, because we've had a lot of CEOs create video presentations that could storyboard the whole thing over 10, 15, 20 minutes to certain stakeholder groups. That was really like, sitting down with someone one-on-one, but you could do that with larger masses and larger audiences. But going through the communication plan, you'll be surprised how many people that you need to communicate with, but there's some that are very critical to do immediately upon announcing, and depending upon which organization, or which sector you're in. And then there's others that you can kind of take your time in getting to over the course of weeks or months.
And I think an important element of that is you get so caught up in the organizational elements of it, but remembering your constituents and the folks that you're serving and working with on a day-to-day basis, whether it's children or adults or elderly or et cetera, and making sure that you have an inclusive process and communication process there also to make sure folks are aware of why and how and the impact or not impact, and making sure that they have a clear voice in that. The final question I'll ask, Eric, which is one you won't be surprised about, is, well, how do you resource this? How do you think about resourcing this? And it might be a phased approach or et cetera, but what are some ideas there? What have you seen? And any comments on that?
Yeah, sure. So, depending upon which type of transaction it is, obviously the mergers and affiliations are probably going to cost more than the others because of just the level of complexity that's involved in them. But first, depending upon your organization and who you have sitting at your board, you might have attorneys on your board, or you might have CPAs, or you might have even investment bankers that have gone through the mergers on the for-profit or the nonprofit side. So factoring in how can you leverage that experience into the conversation to be able to support or maybe even offset some of the costs, because again, you're going to experience the most costs in due diligence. It's in paying for the attorneys and the CPAs and the consultants and things like that to come in and do a lot of this work. So some organizations will resource it in-house. If it's a merger or affiliation, they might agree, they'll split costs evenly if there's any joint ones, any joint costs. Others will try to reach out and connect with, foundations, or maybe they'll go to their board if they have any donors on their board that can, subsidize any of the work, or reach out to maybe some of their top donors to see if they'll subsidize the work. And so I think the good news about whether they're asking a donor or a foundation for this type of thing, it's a one-time ask. It's not a reoccurring cost, right? The idea is it's almost like a startup company where you have startup costs that you need to incur, but over time you'll realize a benefit to the merger, affiliation, et cetera, of some sort of cost savings, which will put you into a better financial position. So I think that's a blessing as well when you're looking on the philanthropic side. But I'm happy to answer any more questions that people have. My email's here, eric@curtisstrategy.com. If you want to shoot me an email or connect with me offline, happy to get any information out to you or answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, and the final follow-up on the resource, we've definitely heard a lot of sort of funders and philanthropists and other foundations that are very aware of this also. And I think there is a current interest in saying, how do we help nonprofits navigate this crisis, whether it's through partnership or affiliation or merger, et cetera, and a real interest to sort of facilitate that one-time transformational activity like you're talking about, Eric, in this process. And then the other thing, obviously, is that if the costs are prohibitive for whatever reason, you can look at earlier parts of the partnership continuum that are perhaps less costly and that allow you to start dating in the process before you sort of make the leap to something that might be more intensive over time and give you some time to think through the resourcing of that, which is obviously something that a lot of organizations do. But
absolutely.
But time is up. We are extremely thankful to Eric and his team for helping pull this together and work with us on this, and really thankful for everyone else's time and energy to come and participate in this. This is the folks on the phone, you all on the Zoom, you all are the change makers. You are the ones in the community driving this change, doing the work every day, and inspiring all of us with your passion and energy. And we need to continue to keep this concept of partnership, affiliation, merger, collaboration in any form front of mind as we navigate through this crisis and plan for the future. We are all connected. Through this process, we've seen this just in spades. And so, we're going to continue to seek ways. How do we collaborate? How do we think more systemically in what we do? How do we see the challenges and be creative and build some of these strong relationships and partnerships and improve the overall system and everything that we're doing. And so as a community foundation, we're going to continue to offer trainings like this and be responsive. We're looking at other ways that we can help educate and inform our nonprofit community through this difficult time, and we will continue to do that. We will share out the presentation, we'll share out the recording, we'll share out the chat. So stay tuned for all of that. For those that had to jump off, I know a lot of people had to jump off at different points or came on late, so we'll make sure we share all of that off. And if you have any questions for Eric, you got his email, or for the Community Foundation, you can reach us also. And a huge, huge thanks for your time, and good luck, and be safe.
Thank you, everyone.